Picture a war so devastating it supposedly lasted 10 years, destroyed an entire city, and killed some of the greatest heroes the ancient world ever imagined. Now picture historians agreeing almost unanimously that the woman blamed for starting it all may never have existed in the first place. That's the strange position Helen of Troy occupies. She's one of the most famous women in Western storytelling, and yet the honest answer to was she real is closer to almost certainly not, at least not in the way the myth describes her. But here's what makes this genuinely interesting. The city she supposedly caused a war over was real, and the ancient world couldn't even agree on what actually happened to her. Let's start with what we can actually confirm. In 1870, a businessman turned amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann began digging at a site called Hisarlik in what's now northwestern Turkey. He was chasing something almost everyone at the time considered pure fiction, proof that Troy, the city from Homer's Iliad, had actually existed. What he found were layer upon layer of ancient settlements, built directly on top of each other across roughly 4,000 years. Troy was real. That part isn't up for debate anymore. Archaeologists later identified one particular layer, known as Troy VIIa, as the strongest candidate for Homer's city. It was destroyed by fire sometime around 1180 BCE, and excavators found arrowheads, unburied bodies, and clear signs of violent destruction in that layer. Hittite records from the same general period even mention a place called Wilusa, likely their name for Troy, and describe military conflict there. So a war, or more likely a series of wars, over that city almost certainly happened. But here's where the story falls apart. Homer wasn't writing history. He was composing poetry, probably sometime in the 8th or 9th century BCE, several hundred years after the events he was describing supposedly took place. And when historians and archaeologists go looking specifically for Helen, the trail goes cold immediately. There's no inscription, no burial, no artifact, nothing that connects a real historical woman to the events at Troy. Schliemann himself once triumphantly displayed a collection of ancient jewelry he called the Jewels of Helen. Later analysis showed that jewelry was roughly 1,000 years too old to have belonged to anyone involved in the Trojan War. He wasn't lying exactly, he just badly wanted it to be true. And it gets stranger than simply, there's no evidence. Even ancient writers writing centuries after Homer couldn't agree on what supposedly happened to Helen. The historian Herodotus, writing around 430 BCE, recorded a version of the story he'd heard directly from Egyptian priests, and it completely contradicts the famous one. In this version, Paris and Helen never made it to Troy at all. Their ship was blown off course by a storm and landed in Egypt instead. Once there, Paris's own servants turned against him and reported the whole situation to the Egyptian pharaoh, who was apparently unimpressed. He let Paris leave, but he kept Helen and all the stolen treasure in Egypt until her actual husband could come collect her. According to this version, the entire 10-year war was fought over a woman who was never even in the city the whole time. Herodotus wasn't just repeating gossip either. He laid out the logic explicitly. If Helen had really been inside Troy the entire war, the Trojans would have simply handed her over the moment the cost became clear. No city endures a decade of siege and mass death to protect one woman who isn't even theirs to protect. Other ancient sources back this up. The poet Stesichorus, writing even earlier than Herodotus, claimed the real Helen spent the whole war safely in Egypt while the gods sent a phantom double, a fake Helen made of cloud, to Troy in her place. Centuries later, the playwright Euripides built an entire tragedy around that same idea. Multiple independent ancient traditions, not just one, insisted that the most famous version of the story, the one where Helen is inside the walls of Troy the entire time, might not be true even within the mythology itself. Which brings us to a phrase almost everyone associates with her, the face that launched 1,000 ships. It sounds like it should come from Homer, given how ancient and mythic it feels. It doesn't. That exact line was written by the English playwright Christopher Marlowe in his 1604 play Dr. Faustus, nearly 2,000 years after Homer composed the Iliad. In the scene, a character conjures up an image of Helen and marvels at her beauty in exactly those words. It's also almost entirely a product of Renaissance England, not ancient Greece. So what's actually left of Helen of Troy once you strip away the poetry, the phantom doubles, and the misattributed treasure? A real city that burned. A real conflict the Hittites documented under a different name. and a woman who may have been based on a real historical figure, a queen or noblewoman whose story got reshaped, exaggerated, and eventually turned into the most famous casus belli in Western literature, without anyone ever quite agreeing on what she actually did or where she actually was while it happened. Maybe that's the most honest thing you can say about her. Not that she launched 1,000 ships, just that everyone who ever told her story, from Homer to Herodotus to a playwright working 2,000 years later, needed her to be somewhere specific, doing something specific, and none of them could ever fully agree on where or what.